kind of right in front of me there, and guy gets out and he walks right up to my car, kind of looks at my license plate, and he goes, "Hey," because I have tribal plates. He says, "You're from Grand Portage," and I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I used to work up there." So I asked him what his name was. I'd never heard of him, but here he had worked on the reservation, I guess, for I don't know, a couple of years. But anyway, it's funny how we make those connections sometimes. So moving on here. So as you mentioned, I am a lifelong resident of the North Shore of Lake Superior. I was born in Grand Marais, and I've lived the majority of my life here in Grand Portage at the very northeast tip of the state. And photography, it's my passion, but it's not how I make my living. I also work a day job for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. I'm the park manager at Grand Portage State Park, where I've worked for the past 17 years. And I've been a photographer for most of my life. And I've been photographing the night sky, which is my favorite subject, for well over 20 years now. I love photographing the night sky, but I also love the simple act of just being with it and experiencing it. I've also traveled pretty extensively throughout the West and Southwest and Alaska, but I'm always drawn back to the beauty that we have here in this unique place that is northern Minnesota. And one of the reasons I love northern Minnesota so much is because it is, of course, my ancestral homeland, with my family history going back probably farther than I even realized, but also because it is kind of an oasis of darkness. I've experienced the night sky in more places than I can count around the world, but in my opinion, none of these places compares to the quality of the night sky available to us here in Minnesota. I've loved the night sky for as long as I can remember. From nights spent with my dad while he was capturing images of the sky on film, to after dark walks with my mom, to moonlight hikes and bike rides, the night sky has always been there, and I've always embraced it. As I like to say, it's a different world from that of the daylight hours. Nighttime is kind of a magic time. You know, the world looks different at night, more mysterious. Sound travels differently. The quality of light on the landscape defies description. And nights spent under the glow of a sky filled with stars and the dancing lights of the aurora are some of the best memories that I have. And these experiences stick with you and increase your appreciation for the outdoors like few others can. This photograph here was made during the Perseid Meteor shower in August of 2020. And it also coincided with the appearance of Comet Neowise, which you can see just above the trees right below Ursa Major, or the Great Bear, more commonly known as the Big Dipper. And on the right side, you can also see a Perseid meteor streaking through the sky, kind of going up and to the right. This one was made during the Perseid meteor shower back in August of this year. So Sarah and I, we took the boat and ventured out into the middle of one of our local lakes. We dropped the anchor and started watching the sky. It only took a moment to see our first meteor. When we first got positioned on the lake, the sky was free of clouds and the surface of the lake was smooth as glass. The sky flooded with stars above us and the smooth surface of the lake, reflecting those same stars below us, made it feel like we were hovering right in the middle of the Milky Way. After just a few minutes though, some clouds started to move in and a light breeze kicked up. The breeze made the front of the boat drift kind of back and forth, left and right. And as we drifted, my camera, which was shooting 20-second exposures, turned the stars into these streaks, making it look more like a star trail exposure that are typically, 20 or 30 minutes or more. And it was the first time I've seen that effect in such a short exposure. We spent about an hour on the lake, and during that time we saw at least 20 or 30 meteors streaking through the sky. that whole experience was very surreal, and like so many, is one we will never forget. So when it comes to photography, I'm pretty much self-taught. I've learned mostly by reading books and by trial and error with the camera. And I did shoot film for a while, but I'm mostly kind of a child of digital. Like, I shot film for actually quite a few years, but didn't shoot very much film. And when I first got my first digital camera is when I like really embraced it and really started taking off with it, because the learning just happened so much quicker with digital. And when I got into doing the night sky stuff, you know, probably like anybody that's tried it, my first shots were kind of big failures. But failing, of course, is one of the best ways that we learn. And this photograph here, it's what I consider to be one of my first successes at photographing the Northern Lights. The foreground subject is a cedar tree known as Manido Gigigants in the Ojibwe language. And the English translation is Spirit Little Cedar Tree. This tree overlooks Lake Superior on the reservation where I live. And I live about 1 mile away from it and photograph it often. When I started getting into night sky photography, this tree was one of the first subjects that I wanted to capture with the aurora. And contrary to what a lot of people believe when they look at this photo, the orange that we see on the horizon is not the approaching sunrise, but rather the glow of city lights coming from Thunder Bay, Ontario, which is almost 40 miles away. And this one here is one of my earliest successes at photographing the Milky Way. I call this one Starman, the title being inspired by the movie from the 1980s starring Jeff Bridges. I had been playing around with my flashlights for several exposures when I came up with the concept for this shot. So I had my back to the camera and realized that if I tipped the lights slightly backwards towards the camera, it would make these sort of glowing orb shapes in my hands. And this was a 30-second exposure where I held my hands downwards for a few seconds and then slowly raised them up a little bit, then held them steady for the remainder of the exposure, which then made these short streaks. And my imagination kind of runs wild with this one. I envisioned the Starman, you know, creating the stars with his mind while holding his arms out and then flinging those stars up into the sky. So northern Minnesota, it sounds like maybe a couple of you guys have been here before. It's a pretty special place. Here on the edge of the boreal forest, my home is surrounded by lakes, rivers, ancient mountains, and of course, Lake Superior, the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. That is to say, I never have a shortage of things to photograph. And the two small lakes shown here are just a few miles inland from Lake Superior on the Grand Portage Reservation. There's an old fire tower that you can climb to access this view. And as you can see here in late September, it provides for one of the best fall color views in the state. This is one of my favorite places to visit. It only takes me about 20 to 25 minutes to drive from my house to the fire tower. And the view in winter is just as impressive, especially when you have fresh snow blanketing the trees. A little more difficult to get to though, as the road to the tower isn't plowed. It's groomed for snowmobiling, and I often like to get there by skiing or riding my fat bike, which I hear is a pretty popular activity around Anchorage, fat biking. One of my favorite natural features to photograph is high falls on the Pigeon River, which is the main attraction at Grand Portage State Park, the park that I manage for my day job. With a drop of 120 feet, it's the tallest waterfall in Minnesota. And since it lies on the Pigeon River, which forms the international boundary between the US and Ontario, technically speaking, half of the waterfall is in Canada. It's also one of the smallest state parks in Minnesota. And as it resides on tribal land, it is the only state park in Minnesota that is not owned by the state. And High Falls is a pretty major tourist draw for the area. So far in 2021, we've seen just shy of 95,000 visitors to the park. And at just under 300 acres in size, it might be small, but it has a lot to offer. 5 miles of trail leading to 2 waterfalls with terrain that challenges even the most experienced hikers. And the high point in the park is about 350, almost 400 feet higher than the elevation of the Pigeon River. And there are awesome views of Lake Superior from ridgetop overlooks along the trails. High Falls is also one of those waterfalls that never gets boring to photograph. It always looks impressive regardless of the season or the water level. And here we see a typical low water view in late fall, early winter. And here's a view showing the falls and gorge fully blanketed in snow in late December. And one showing the peak flow in the spring. At low water level, the flow might be down to as little as about 500 gallons per second. But at peak levels like we see here, it can get up to 50,000 gallons per second. And in the spring, when the water is high and you've got a nice sunny day, you get really kind of picture perfect end-to-end rainbows framed right in front of the falls. It's even a great waterfall for capturing moonbows on full moon nights. And last but not least, the view of the falls is to the north, so you can capture nice northern lights over it too. Photographing it during high water level presents a challenge though, as the viewpoints are rather close to the falls. So you get a lot of spray and mist hitting the viewing decks. It's not uncommon to have to wipe your lens clean after every single shot that you take. The subject with a seemingly infinite number of moods and infinite number of ways to photograph, however, is Lake Superior. The big lake is never boring, that's for sure. And the view shown here, this is called Grand Portage Island, or Pete's Island, as all the locals call it. It's about a mile straight out into the lake from my house. And locals call it Pete's Island after Pete Gagne, who ran a store on the island in the early 1900s, when the only way to travel up and down the shore was by boat. The steamship America used to dock on the island because the rest of the bay was too shallow to access. And the America, if you've never heard of it, used to run between Duluth, Minnesota and Thunder Bay, Ontario, making stops at the many shoreline communities along the way. It also stopped at Isle Royal, which is now a national park, but not at the time that the steamship was running. And located just a few miles north of Grand Portage Bay, we have a small archipelago of islands called the Susie Islands. The Susies are pretty unique and home to some plant species that are normally found only in Arctic regions. And the rocks along the shoreline are covered with many varieties of lichen. And while the grouping of islands is pretty small, really, I think there's 12 or 13, and the largest one is maybe, I don't know, 50 acres in size. Still large enough and has enough bays and little nooks and crannies that I've found countless places along the shoreline to make for compelling photographs. It's possible to find many places providing good angles for both sunset and sunrise photos. Lake Superior is also rather famous for its storms, and November, of course, tends to be the stormiest month. You might have heard of the gales of November. The highest recorded wave height on Lake Superior is almost 30 feet. And the lake is notorious for not only how large the waves can get, but also how close they can be together. Yeah, they're much closer together than large ocean swells. And I've heard, not directly from some of these saltwater vessel captains, but I've heard through people in kind of the boating community that ocean captains, when they come through the Great Lakes and get to Duluth, coming across Lake Superior actually scares them more than being on the ocean because of the proximity of the large waves to each other. We're out on the ocean, they're much farther apart. So this photograph and the next one were taken at Tetagooch State Park, which is a popular spot for wave watchers during these storms. The cliffs here are undercut slightly, which makes the waves explode outwards and upwards with pretty impressive force. And the cliffs are about 50 to 60 feet high. So that gives you an idea of how big that these waves can get on this lake. And as these big storms tend to be in the late fall or winter, they're often accompanied by freezing temperatures. And this means that all that spray getting flung up into the trees on top of the cliffs ends up coating the trees in thick layers of ice, with icicles hanging down everywhere. And it turns the forest into basically a frozen winter wonderland. That is one of the coolest things I've ever photographed, and also one of the most difficult to photograph. And I say that because walking around in the frozen forest is a real challenge, and ice cleats on your boots are basically a necessary piece of equipment. Pretty easy to slip and twist your ankle when walking around in here. And here is a picture of my friend Paul photographing. He kind of blends in with the rocks, but he's down there in the lower left. Gives you some nice scale with these ice formations. These were taken just north of Grand Marais, a couple of days after a big storm. And when you see how calm the lake is here and the scale of this ice formations, it's hard to believe that the waves and spray get big enough to make these kind of fortresses of ice. So as beautiful as Lake Superior is in the warm seasons, my favorite season by far is winter. I love photographing ice almost as much as I love photographing the night sky. Ice takes on seemingly infinite forms and patterns. And if you love making abstract images, then start paying attention to ice if you don't already. I call this one Lake Superior Ice Monster. It's kind of a cap of ice that is formed on a small rock just off the edge of the shoreline. So the rock, when the waves go over it, the rock gets exposed for just a second or two, and each time it's exposed, a little bit of ice will freeze, and then the next wave comes, washes over it, puts another layer on it, and eventually you get all these little layers and bubbly looking things. It just looks really wild. And this one I call ice ornaments. It's hard for me to imagine how these formed, but they were hanging off the side of a rock near the shoreline, with the bottom of the ornaments just an inch or two above the surface of the water. And I would say from the bottom of the ice to the top of the photo here is maybe about 8 or 9 inches, so they're not very big. And this one shows ice that has formed in a puddle on the shoreline. In early winter, before we get any snow, it's a lot of fun to walk along the shore and look for these frozen puddles. This one was about maybe 2 feet across in size. And of course, the plates of ice, which are my absolute favorite. This occurs when you get ice ranging from an inch, maybe an inch thick, to several inches thick, forming out on the lake. Then the wind comes, breaks that ice up into these plates and pushes them against shore. And as they push against each other, they get shoved up into these crazy looking piles where you've got kind of angles of ice everywhere you look. It looks like a bunch of windows kind of out there, and it sounds, I don't know if you get similar things happening up there in Alaska, but when these things are getting pushed up on shore, it's deafening, and it just sounds like an incredible, you can't even comprehend how loud it is, and it just sounds like a bunch of breaking glass. And here's another one of some plate ice that was sticking almost straight up. The straight line you see in the background here is the horizon line on Lake Superior. And I don't know, I could photograph ice for just days on end. I never get tired of it. So jumping back to non-winter seasons here for a few minutes, I have a couple of wildlife stories I'd like to share. This is one of my favorite inland lakes near where I live. And in the summer of 2011, it was the location of a pretty amazing wildlife adventure that I'll never forget. So working for the state, our fiscal year ends on June 30th. And the weeks leading up to that day were filled with talk of a government shutdown on July 1st. And so I had the 30th off, and my friend Roger and I, we had been exploring the shoreline of this lake, looking for painted turtles, which are often sunning themselves on logs near shore. And as we came around a corner on the shoreline, we spotted a loon nest in some tall grass. It was perfectly situated for us to watch it and photograph it from underneath some large pine trees about 75 feet away and not disturb the loons. And we discovered the nest towards the end of the day, so we were able to capture it with some really nice low sunlight before the sun dipped behind the trees. And for very selfish reasons, we immediately hoped that the government would shut down so I wouldn't have to work the next day and we could spend the day watching the nest. Sure enough, the next morning we got the news. No budget agreement, so the state would be shutting down most of its agencies, including the one that I work for. So we headed up to the lake and spent 9 hours that day watching the nest. We saw the adults switch places on the nest a couple of times and got to see them flip the eggs more than once, but no chicks were born on that day. And for the next couple of weeks, I watched the nest for several hours each day, hoping to see a chick hatch. And when I arrived at the lake on July 14th, 2 weeks later, I could immediately tell something was different. The adult looked more alert than usual and was looking around constantly as it sat on the nest. After a few minutes, I heard a faint kind of psh, 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 psh sound that was coming from the tall grass off to the right. And the adult responded with a very low call, just kind of really soft call. And then I saw this newly hatched chick swimming furiously out from the tall grass. It swam up to the nest and crawled up to the adult, resting its head on the chest of its parent. And after a few moments, the adult raised its wing and the chick crawled underneath. I watched for a few more hours that day, but the other chick wasn't born by the time I left. And the next day when I arrived, I hoped that maybe by some chance the other chick still hadn't been born. But seeing the nest quickly dispelled that hope. I could immediately see that the nest was vacant and there were broken eggshells visible. So, in anticipation of this, I had brought my solo canoe along. I launched the canoe and paddled out into the lake. And this lake isn't very big, so it didn't take very long to find the loons. Once I was out in the middle of the lake, I put the paddle down and just drifted, scanning for the birds. And after just a minute or two, I spotted them and paddled just a little ways in their direction. And once I was a couple 100 feet away, I set the paddle down again and just kind of let the canoe drift wherever it would. The loons didn't seem to mind, and eventually they were swimming past about 25 feet away from the canoe. And both chicks were riding on the back of the one adult. So for the next couple of weeks, I headed to the lake at sunrise to catch the morning routine of the adults diving for minnows to feed the chicks. They had pretty voracious appetites and ate almost everything that the parents presented to them. And morning light was by far the best light on this lake. The mornings were often very calm and quiet, which really made it a lot of fun to watch and photograph the family. The adults would take turns diving for minnows, and each time they came up with one, the chicks would snap it out of their mouths almost immediately. It was really cool to see how the adults would approach the young, riding really low in the water so they were at their level, making it easier to pass the minnows to them. And some of the nights were pretty chilly, which made for beautiful fog in the morning. After the morning feedings were done, the chicks would just cruise around on the backs of the adults for quite a while. The young ones got big fast, and by the end of July, the adults were starting to leave them alone for periods of time. The government shutdown also ended, which meant that I had to return to work and couldn't spend as much time watching them anymore. But I checked on them from time to time throughout August and early September, and one day when I went to the lake, they were gone, presumably headed south for the winter. And this other story, in September of 2019, I was invited by my friend Paul to accompany him on a moose calling adventure. So Paul had been scouting some locations and thought he had found a good area to call one in. I met him at about 6 in the morning, and after 30 minutes of driving, we were at this planned location that he had scouted. There was dense fog that morning, and the air was completely still. Paul started calling just as the sun was rising. Of course, we couldn't see it because of the fog, but the conditions were perfect for calling. The sounds seemed to carry for a long ways. And we tried a couple of different locations, but after an hour, we hadn't seen or heard anything. And Paul had pretty much given up on seeing anything. He said, if you don't get one to come out in the first hour, you're probably not going to get one to come out at all. But still, he kept calling just to get some practice, he said. And I wandered a short distance away, and I was about to photograph this small white pine, maybe 3 feet tall, when I noticed movement near the big pines off in the distance. I looked closer and at first didn't see anything because of the fog, but then after a moment I saw it, a bull moose coming out of the fog right near those trees. I looked towards Paul. He was maybe about 50 feet away now, and caught his eye and then pointed towards the trees and whispered, "There's a moose over there." Paul looked at me kind of confused and said, "What?" He kind of hollered, "What?" So I raised my finger to my lips and I was like, "Shh, there's a moose over there." And I pointed again. This time he looked over and he saw the moose right away. And so we walked back to my Jeep as quietly as we could, and then watched the moose as it slowly walked along the edge of the mature pines. Every now and then it would stop and look in our direction. And slowly it came closer and closer, but it wasn't in any hurry and seemed to be more curious than anything. We swore, though, that he knew he was being photographed, as it seemed that he kept stopping in like these perfect places for nice photos. He would move a little closer, then pause, then move a little closer, then pause again. And each time he stopped, he would look around slowly and cautiously before moving forward again. I was worried my pictures weren't turning out because of the dense fog and the low light, but way too excited to take my eyes off the moose and check the photos on the camera. And eventually he came to the road a couple of 100 feet ahead of where we were. When he got to the edge of the road, he stopped again and looked right towards us, but didn't come any closer. He stood there for what seemed like several minutes, then turned and walked away down the road. So as we drove away, our talk centered kind of on how lucky we were, how we had thought the morning was going to be a bust after that first hour, but then being presented with this incredible experience. Oh, is there a question in the chat?
I don't see any at this time, but your pictures are beautiful and awesome.
Just a comment. Love this shot. Thank you. Are we doing okay on time? I don't know how much time I have, so.
You're doing great on time.
Okay. Okay, let's see. So now I'm going to kind of transition into more of my nighttime stuff. I like to oftentimes try to think of creative titles for my photos, and titles that kind of match the scene or make people maybe think more about what the photo might mean. And this one I call it, the sight of the stars makes me dream. So nature, it likes to remind us how small we are. When you sit on the shoreline of the largest freshwater lake in the world and stare out at the Milky Way floating above the horizon, you can't help but be reminded of that. The vastness of space is a magnificent thing to try and comprehend. And here's what I wrote about this photo in my blog on March 11th, 2018. Last night was an unforgettable one. I spent a couple hours hanging out on the Lake Superior shoreline just north of Grand Marais. It was a clear, cold night, which meant the view of the stars was incredible. Just before 4 a.m., the thin crescent moon rose above the horizon. The subdued moonlight behind the island made for a surreal glow, with the Milky Way stretching across the sky above. There was absolutely no wind, and the air was extremely quiet. A thin layer of ice had formed on the surface of the water, and I could hear its crunching noises as the currents in the lake moved it around further out from shore. Nights like this are some of my favorite times to be outside. And the summer night sky, at least here in Minnesota, it tends to get most of the attention from like tourists and such, because that's when we have this big glorious view of the ribbon of the Milky Way. But the winter night sky, I would say, is equally as impressive. We might not have that view of the ribbon of the Milky Way, but the cold nights make the stars seem larger and more vivid, even closer somehow. Some nights it seems the stars are so close you could reach up and pick them right out of the sky. So this photo here was taken in January during the new moon phase, when the nights are about as dark as they get. And as you can see, the nights are never truly completely dark. During new moon, the starlight is often so bright that it illuminates snow-covered trees and ground well enough to see with the naked eye. And every year I notice too that quite a few people are dreading the end of fall and lamenting the loss of the leaves on the trees. And I can relate to that, as November does tend to be, I guess, the dreariest month of the year in more ways than one. However, once the colors start to fade from the leaves, I really look forward to them falling to the ground. All summer long, the leaves block the view of the night sky. And one of the things I like most about late fall and winter is that these night sky views from beneath the forest canopy are restored, so we can see the beautiful shapes and silhouettes that are hidden by leaf cover in the summer. I made this photo while snowshoeing at night, which is one of my favorite things to do in the winter. But sometimes I don't actually snowshoe very far because I'm stopping so often and looking up at the trees and just oohing and aahing at the stars, always on the lookout for the next nice photo composition. Star trails and northern lights. So on the last day of March in 2017, I went out in search of the northern lights. The forecast numbers were looking really good, but by the time I got out on location, the lights were really faint. I decided to try a star trail exposure while waiting to see if the lights would pick up. So I let the camera record for 72 minutes. And during that time, the glow of the northern lights didn't seem to change. It was an almost imperceptible glow that showed up very nicely on the 1 hour and 12-minute exposure. And shots like this, of course, they're a great example that illustrates how, from our perspective at least, the North Star is the only star in the sky that essentially doesn't move and all the other stars rotate around it. And this is the arguably now famous hollow rock on Lake Superior in Grand Portage. If you Google hollow rock, you'll come up with hundreds, if not maybe thousands of photos of it. And it's easily one of my favorite subjects to photograph as well. This was taken in early April, and it's my standard exposure time of 30 seconds for the Milky Way. An exposure time of 30 seconds or less gives us a view of the stars that's very similar to what we see with the naked eye, more or less pinpoints of light. And unlike what we see here, long exposure star trail photos represent something that we're unable to see with our naked eye. So the next one shows the same composition, but with an exposure time of 38 minutes. And as in the previous photo, from the top left to the lower right, you can see kind of this milky band of light, which is the center of the Milky Way galaxy. Like all the more distinct trails that you see from the more prominent stars, the galactic center of the Milky Way moves across our sky, and that light gets spread out when recorded for a long period of time. Also, this is looking south-southeast, so unlike the view to the north where we get these nice circle patterns in the stars, star trail shots to the south show us a curvature but not full circles. And my title for this one is Light Speed. For this one, I lined up the Milky Way right in the center of the photo. And like most of my Milky Way shots, it was also 30 seconds long. However, for the first 15 seconds, I left my camera lens at 14 millimeter. And then for the next 15 seconds, I zoomed the lens in as slowly and smoothly as I could, ending the exposure at 24 millimeter. And the visual that I ended up with, it reminds me a lot of Star Wars when Han Solo says, "Punch it, Chewie," and they go to light speed in the Millennium Falcon. So this one, it kind of looks like it might be mud flats or dirt or rock islands in the foreground, but that's actually late spring ice. So the last of the ice melting off of this lake. And I had this pretty interesting and slightly scary encounter while photographing this scene. I was standing at the end of this short dock on what is known as Chester Lake. And as you can see, it was a really calm night. So calm that the stars were reflecting almost perfectly in the water. But that calm and quiet meant that I could hear every little noise out in the forest. And when I arrived at the lake, there were a couple of rabbits running around in the brush near the shore. I had seen them in my headlights when I first pulled up to the boat landing. So as I took in the view over the lake and thought about how I wanted to photograph it, I could hear them chasing each other back and forth in the woods. And after a while, they either got tired or left the area as there was no longer any sound. And by then I was making my first exposures and kind of getting my composition dialed in. By the time I had everything just right, I could once again hear rustling in the woods behind me. Only this time it sounded different. This time it sounded like a much larger animal. So I turned and faced the shoreline, but of course it was too dark to see anything. The noises kept coming closer. I heard a couple of twigs snap, and then, I kid you not, I could hear the exhale of its breath. I turned on the soft red light of my headlamp, and there was a moose standing there near the edge of the lake, less than 30 feet away. And all of a sudden I got pretty nervous. My heart rate elevated rapidly. but I stood still and I tried not to make a sound. I turned off my headlamp and the moose turned and started to walk through the brush along the water's edge. It walked right past the end of the dock and through the brush for maybe another 50 feet along the lakeshore. Then it turned and headed back inland. And once I could no longer hear it, I let out a sigh of relief and went back to photographing the scene. I never saw or heard the moose again that night. And so, while my nerves might have been a little on edge after that encounter, I decided to hang out there for quite a while longer until eventually the moon started to rise. And later, when I left the lake, I could see the tracks from the moose on the gravel road as I drove away. Standing under the glow of the Milky Way in such a beautiful spot is special enough, but having a wildlife encounter such as that makes it even more memorable. In 2018, we had this, what I called on my website, amazing conjunction of celestial bodies that lasted for a good part of the summer. So on the left here, this kind of looks like the moon is actually Mars. And over on the right side is Jupiter. And right in the middle of the Milky Way, somewhere in there is Saturn. And this conjunction lasted for a good part of the summer. The island shown here is Hollow Rock once again, only this time looking southwest instead of southeast. And the glow on the clouds is coming from city lights from Grand Marais, which is about 35 miles down the shore. On July 10th, as I stood on this shoreline here in awe of this sky, I felt like I was kind of in a real life science fiction movie, and the scene evoked more imagery reminiscent of Star Wars, like the scene where Luke Skywalker is standing out on the desert on Tatooine watching multiple suns setting down towards the horizon. So throughout my life, I've learned a lot about anchors. And when I say an anchor, I'm not talking an anchor that, not a heavy anchor that keeps you weighted down like a ship's anchor, but rather those things in our lives that keep us grounded and centered. Things that we need in order to stay true to ourselves. And in that vein, I have a quote that I'd like to share with you. And it goes like this. We've all experienced that cloud that can consume us. Times in life when things can be hazy and unclear, emotionally, mentally, and physically. That's when we call on our anchors, the things that we trust. Do your best to find and identify those anchors in your life. They'll help you push through those clouds to greater clarity, harmony, and positive results. Life's clouds and haze will always come and go. Find your anchors to help you push through. So as much as I might like to lay claim to those words of wisdom, I cannot. They came from an Instagram post by Dwayne Johnson, perhaps better known as The Rock. I find them to be very relatable to a lot of my imagery, as I often show both water and sky together in my photographs. And water connects the earth and the sky. In addition to photography, the night sky and water are some of my most important anchors. They help bring balance to my life. When I sit on the shoreline of a calm lake at night, staring out at a sky full of stars, reflected in the surface of the water, I feel centered and at peace. On October 2nd, 2013, there were some awesome lights that were quite a bit of a surprise. Spaceweather.com said, arriving a little earlier than expected, a CME or coronal mass ejection hit Earth's magnetic field at 0200 Universal Time. The impact sparking a G2 class storm with auroras across Canada and several northern tier states. So that night I had just finished watching a movie, and I was laying in bed looking at Facebook on my phone when I noticed there were some posts about the lights being out. So I looked at some forecast websites, and sure enough, they indicated that the aurora was at storm level. So even though I had been super tired just moments before, I was instantly wide awake again after walking out onto my deck and seeing this big glowing arc of aurora over Mount Josephine in my backyard. So of course, the next thing I did, I gathered my gear, hopped in my truck, and headed inland to photograph the lights, spending the next 4 hours watching probably the best storm to occur that year. October 7th, 2015. This storm started off quietly with a very soft glow just above the tree line. And by about 2 o'clock in the morning, the activity was picking up considerably. And there was a ribbon of light undulating across the northern sky. One of the first photographs I made of the lights that night, the area shown here, is one of my favorite locations for viewing the night sky and kind of that classic like Minnesota Northwoods lake scene. And between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., the sky pretty much exploded and the aurora was dancing like crazy. I stopped at several different locations and made some nice images, but my favorite was this inland lake that provided a nice wide open view of the sky. And it didn't hurt that it was such a calm night. The calm air and still water was perfect for enjoying this light show. And now it's about 4:45 a.m. and the lights were at their most intense. In addition to the ribbon of green waving horizontally above the horizon, vertical pillars of light awash in hues of white, green, and purple shot up and then wiggled their way across the sky. 5:20 now, and things were starting to quiet down. The dancing pillars were slowly fading, and that horizontal ribbon was lowering itself closer to the horizon, slowing its movement. But the glow persisted as night transitioned to day. And to me, that night as a collective felt like one giant breath of the solar wind, ending much like it started. The first part of the night felt like this drawing of a deep and powerful inhale. And the peak of activity with the pillars and brisk movement of light, kind of like the initial surge of an exhale. And then the quiet that approached dawn, like that final bit of breath leaving the lungs, preparing for the next inhale. So many times when the lights are out here in northern Minnesota, we don't see the awesome ribbons or pillars that everyone imagines when they think of photos of the aurora. Instead, what we see is just kind of this real soft glow on the horizon that to the untrained eye can easily be mistaken for the glow of city lights. But if you take a picture of it, you'll see it's in fact the glow of the aurora, which most often shows up in photos as a bright green color, but to our naked eye, it usually looks as kind of an off-white or gray. And this location here is one of probably my favorite spot, at least within a 2-hour drive of where I live for Northern Lights. Not only because it provides a perfect lake view, but also because most of the time it's a very quiet spot. But on the night of July 11th, 2015, it was a very different story. It was memorable not only because it had one of the best aurora shows that I've seen, but also because of what I heard as I sat on the shoreline watching the lights dance overhead. When I arrived at this lake, I immediately could hear voices in the distance. There are a couple of state forest campsites on the lake, and one of them was occupied by what sounded like 3 young men in their early 20s. And thanks to the stillness of the night and the acoustics of the bay, I could hear everything they were saying, even though they were a couple hundred feet down the shore. At first, I was annoyed by how loud they were. But once I started to pay attention to what they were saying, I was pretty entertained by the conversation. which went something like this. Dude, how old do you think that tree is? That one that looks like it's about 15 feet tall. I don't know, man. Maybe 20, 25 years old? That tree is probably the same age as us. I wonder if it's as smart as we are. You know, that tree is probably just as important to the universe as we are, maybe more. Man, can you imagine what all that solar energy must be doing to our atmosphere? I mean, it's got to be doing something. That's a lot of energy just slamming into us. It's got to have some sort of effect. So as the night went on, there were a lot more things that were said as they were talking constantly. But eventually they launched their canoe and paddled out around the point. They were out on the lake for about a half hour before paddling back in. And I don't think they ever had any idea that I was there. We're pretty lucky in northern Minnesota in that we can see aurora events any month of the year. Our summer nights, you know, they do tend to be a lot shorter than the winter nights, but it still gets dark enough here in the summer to have at least maybe 6 hours of daylight or darkness, dark enough to see the auroras if they're occurring. Case in point, this one from mid-May 2015. Auroras over Mount Josephine and Hat Point in Grand Portage. So this is my neighborhood, kind of over towards the right side of the photo. I live in between those clusters of lights over there, but you can't actually see my place because I don't leave any outside lights on at night. And this was one of those nights where the lights were super active, moving quickly and constantly throughout the sky. In 2015, that was an awesome year for northern lights. They occurred frequently and they were strong, sometimes filling 2/3 or more of the sky. And this night, which was June 23rd, was probably the best of the aurora shows that I've seen in Minnesota. I had planned on heading inland that night to photograph the show over an inland lake, but I never made it up there. As I was driving down Highway 61, I saw the lights erupting over Lake Superior, which is to the south. There wasn't much happening at all in the northern sky that night. The lights were all either directly overhead or to the south. And this photo, it kind of blew my mind because it was the first time where I captured such powerful aurora and the Milky Way together in the same shot. So you can see the Milky Way kind of over on the lower right, and it arcs up to the upper left. And after making this image, I adjusted my camera to shoot straight up into the sky. And this is what I saw. I call this one Imaginarium because it definitely sparks the imagination. And a few of the things that I saw when I first looked at it were, I guess the first thing I saw was a cranky cat. And then I saw a bird. And then the face of the Grinch jumped out at me. But you might see something completely different. So I kept my camera focused upwards for quite a while and just made one exposure after another. The lights were flickering and pulsating so quickly that I shot several hundred images in a rather short period of time. And every one of them looked utterly and completely unique. The lights were also super bright, so my exposures were all pretty short. Most of them were 3 seconds long, maybe 5 seconds long, with the aperture of 2.8 and using an ISO setting of 1600 to 2500. And when I angled my camera back down at Hollow Rock, in addition to the green, there was now a lot of red and purple visible. And this rainbow of colors lasted maybe 15 to 20 minutes, then shifted mostly back to green. Mother's Day aurora over the Spirit Little Cedar Tree. So the early morning hours of May 8th, 2016 produced a beautiful display. And what a perfect way to celebrate Mother's Day, with Mother Nature herself putting on quite an extraordinary show. The lights shown here were around 3 a.m. once the clouds started to part. The night up to this point had been pretty cloudy, but the parting clouds later on at night kind of added a lot to the photos, giving them an extra layer of depth and interest. And this Mother's Day storm gave us this incredibly bold ribbon of green and purple that was waving really quickly across the sky. And I would say much more common probably in places like Alaska or Norway. It's really a special treat to see auroras like this in northern Minnesota. And this was looking east over Waswaganing Bay and the Susie Islands in Grand Portage. And as the night came to an end and daylight ushered in, the ribbon slowed its movement and transitioned to an arc that stretched from west to east across the sky. It was a nice ending to yet another unforgettable night. So I just got a few left here. The past couple of years have been pretty tough on, I'd say, probably everyone, most everyone. The COVID pandemic, it's turned into something that none of us could have ever expected. And it has taken its toll on everyone in different ways. And we've all had to cope with it in ways that make sense to us. Photography and the experiences I have in the pursuit and creation of my images are very healing. And the night sky plays a large part in that. They have proven themselves in that regard time and time again for me throughout my life. And one of the things I mentioned earlier, I like to travel to the Southwest. One of the things I've noticed over many trips to the Southwest is how quiet the desert nights can be. Growing up in the land of water here in northern Minnesota, completely silent nights are hard to come by. Water is almost always moving. And with that movement, of course, there's sound. And in stark contrast to that, I've experienced several nights in the desert where the silence is deafening, and I can't get enough of it. While out photographing the Milky Way this past August, I did see a little bit of aurora glow as well. It was barely visible to the naked eye, but showed up more prominently in long exposure photos. Or this long exposure photo, which is one of only a handful of images that I made that night, and more on that in a moment. The most notable quality of that night, however, was the silence. It was very much like the utterly silent nights that I've experienced in the deserts of the Southwest. So to hear that silence, you need to push everything out of your mind and let yourself truly be in that moment. And most of the time, this is not an easy thing to do. Our minds tend to always be running with some sort of thought or memory. Our subconscious always replaying that day's events or thinking about what might happen tomorrow. And most of the time, I don't think we even realize it. And that's why I like the night sky so much. Basking in the glow of the night sky, for me, it's the easiest way that I can quiet my mind and just be there in the present. When I'm gazing up at the sky, especially on such a quiet night, I feel completely relaxed and refreshed. It's one of the best ways, in my opinion, to balance out the clutter and commotion of modern life. And so for the past few years, I've been practicing mindfulness and being in the moment as much as I can. And that's had a pretty profound effect. I used to busy myself with capturing as many images as possible and thinking about when or how I was going to share them with the world. But lately I've been doing less of that and instead trying to fully immerse myself in each moment and each experience. And much of the time when doing this, I never even take my camera out of the bag. Sometimes when I do make images, I don't share them for a month or more, if I even share them at all. most of the time waiting until it feels right to share them. And a while after I was already into the shift in my method, I watched a TED Talk with actor Joseph Gordon-Levitt. And his talk was about getting attention versus paying attention. And the takeaway quote that resonated with me was, if your creativity is driven by a desire to get attention, then you're never going to be creatively fulfilled. And I realized, at least on some level, that's how I had come to feel. I wasn't feeling as creatively fulfilled anymore because the reasons I was doing photography had become more about satisfying others than about personal fulfillment. So I've been striving to get back to that method of being more mindful with my photography. And in that practice of being mindful, I've noticed that I feel much calmer than I used to. My mind doesn't race the way that it used to. I feel rested and peaceful more often than not. And my actions with the camera are much more deliberate and thought out than they used to be. And I feel like these last few photos are good representations of that mindfulness. Each one is one of less than 5 images that I made on each night. And I feel like they really convey the sense of calm and peacefulness that comes with truly being in a moment right then and there. And they also remind me of a favorite saying and title of a book about mindfulness: wherever you go, there you are. And so with that, I'd like to say miigwech and thank you for having me tonight and listening to my stories.
Travis, that was absolutely beautiful. And what a way to end your presentation. You're a fantastic speaker as well as an awesome photographer. And I will shut up. So I'm sure there's other people that will have questions.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And yeah, if anybody has questions, or I would say I would offer that my website's right here. So if you don't want to ask me something right now, my email is on my website. You can shoot me an email sometime. Looks like we got a couple of messages coming
Yes,
in.
Travis, I agree with everything Kathy said. That was an awesome presentation. I do have one question for you. What's your favorite lens for your night photography?
So it used to be, because I have switched systems. I used to shoot Canon. I'm a Nikon shooter now, and I guess I've been shooting Nikon for about 7 or 8 years. And so when I was shooting Canon, I had a 17-40 f4, which worked, but it wasn't the best because f4 doesn't let all the light in.
Right.
And I guess the reason I switched mostly to Nikon is because at that time, Nikon and Sony, and I believe at the time the Nikon sensors were being made by Sony, but Sony had the reputation of being probably the best sensors for nighttime. And so I ended up buying a neat Nikon D750, and with that I bought Nikon's 14-24 2.8 lens, which is just incredible for night sky. It's not a cheap lens, but it's worth every penny.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And of course, having a full frame camera makes a big difference too. Yeah, thanks for the comments, everybody. There's quite a few over there. Appreciate it.
I just wanted to comment, Travis, thank you very much. Wonderful images from my home state of Minnesota. I grew up 2 hours west of Duluth in a tiny little town called Outing. Very small town. But
I've not heard of that.
Shore as well. I used to have a booth at the Grand Marais Art Fair and Park Point in Duluth as well.
Okay.
And I went up to the boundary waters in Quetico quite a bit near Crane Lake, Lac LaCroix. Yeah.
Nice.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Love the loon images. I think were my favorite.
Yeah, that was fun. That was a heck of a month.
Yeah. Wow. So thank you.
And well timed with our government shutdown.
Alex wrote in the comments, any books you recommend from one self-taught photographer to another?
Yeah, I would say the one that was most influential for me, it's been around a long time now, because I don't know, it was probably written 20 years ago. It was written primarily for film, but it's John Shaw, and I think I'd have to look for the exact title, but John Shaw's Guide to Nature Photography or something like that. We'll see if I can find it quick. And I'll type if I can find it, I'll type the actual title in the comments there. But that one more than any others. I read that book multiple times and I learned a lot from that more than any other book.
I bought one of his books on workflow, I believe, involving, like Lightroom and other software. And yeah, very well written.
Here it is, John Shaw's Nature Photography Field Guide. And it's on Amazon.
More questions? Jen has one more announcement before people disappear. Guess you're up, Jen.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, Travis, thank you. And I loved all your images, but the loons and your ice were my favorites.
Thank you.
So thank you. And then Gail wanted me to make an announcement about Alaska Wild. If anybody did not receive their status notice, to let us know, and we'll get that out to you. Apparently a few people, there must have been some computer thing in the world today. Let us know, and our contact details are on the website or in the e-news. So thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. I'm going to log off because it's going on 11:30 here for me.
Oh,
Yes, thank you for
a
your
late night for
time.
you. Thank you very much again.
Yep, I appreciate you guys having me. Thanks. We'll see ya.
Good night. And
Night.
you do have member slides now for.
I do, yep. Colin, you're up first, and I've got 3 folders for Colin, so I'll start with the first one. Everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, Colin?
Okay, thank you, Alan. This is a recent photo I took out here at the Eagle River Nature Center. We've had a wonderful winter season here. The scenery, the snow, the skiing has been excellent. So I took this one very recently, last month sometime. Okay. Probably recognize that scene from the viewing decks. Yeah, we've had a wonderful winter. It's been cold, but cold weather makes for beautiful skies, beautiful scenery. This was the morning after the eclipse. I didn't photograph the eclipse this time. I got the moon setting the next morning. Also in Eagle River here. Okay.
And let me get another folder going. Oh, nope, there's actually one more.
One more in that folder, yeah.
One more. Okay.
From last summer, one of my favorite moose images from out here at the Nature Center as well. Late June, early July, somewhere in there. And I did a bit of traveling this last year. This was Fagradalsfjall volcano. Whoops, that was.
Oh, yep, there we go.
That was in Iceland last August. Led 2 groups over there, August and early September, and went up to the volcano 4 different times. This was the first time and the most active, and it was spewing all night. It was incredible. It was before our tour actually started, so it was kind of a bonus for the people that showed up early. But yeah, certainly a rare once-in-a-lifetime event, perhaps, although it's still quite active. Okay, go ahead. And this is on the Westman Islands, the largest Atlantic puffin colony in the world, also in Iceland. There was a mention in the last newsletter about we are leading some tours there again next summer. Well, one tour to Iceland in August, and also a tour to Namibia in October. fingers crossed that the travel situation improves by then. But it should have been, excuse me, it was in the last newsletter. If you have any questions, we're definitely offering discounts to ASONP members. And if 2 people booked and shared a room, we could give you an even better price. So just check with me if you're at all interested, and the links should be in there. I think there's one more Puffin photo here. Puffin in flight, also from the Westman Islands. Yes. And then I've got a few from Namibia, which I was there in October.
Okay.
Here we go. My first trip to Africa, and this was in far northeastern Namibia. A herd of elephants, roughly 100 animals, crossed literally right behind this an elephant crossing sign. Perfect timing. Okay. This is more central Namibia, Sesrium National Park. That's an oryx running the famous sand dunes. Early morning when you have the long shadows, the light, the lines, the contours, the contrast. It's just wonderful. And of course, your first time in any new place is always awe-inspiring. So I'll never forget my first trip to Africa, but plan to go back next year. And again, if anyone's interested, the information is in the newsletter, and the tour is already half full. So, okay. This is the Susply ancient dry lake bed. Probably seen a lot of photos from this area. Very popular spot. It's a short hike, a short 4x4 drive, and then a short hike up to the lake bed. Okay. And that's an oryx in the lake bed in Susply. You can see the heat rising from the ground there. By 11 or 12 o'clock, it was easily over 100 degrees, so very warm. So you want to get out, if you're going to hike and hike the dunes, you want to do it early, or the sand just gets too hot on your feet by noon. Culture, I love to photograph culture. I do some portrait work here, but when I'm traveling, I'm much more inspired. And this is a Himba community in northern Namibia, and the women put the red clay in their hair. And it was so we did stop and visit a few cultural sites and a living museum as well. So I always love to photograph culture when I'm traveling. Go ahead. And another sand dune in Sesrium National Park. You can hike up these, and a lot of people do. And the cool thing is the next day, all the tracks are gone because the wind comes through in the afternoon and erases all the tracks. So it's a brand new dune every day. Okay. A black rhino in Etosha National Park. Saw quite a few black rhinos there, one white rhino, mostly black rhinos. Namibia is home to 50% of the remaining black rhinos in the world. And you can see the horns on this one were at one point cut. They've stopped cutting rhino horns. That was an effort to reduce poaching. However, the poachers would still shoot and kill the rhino, so they wouldn't have to track it again. So they've stopped cutting rhino horns to deter poaching. It is still an issue, but Namibia is doing pretty well with it. A very large bull elephant also in Etosha National Park, northern Namibia. Very large. And the one leopard we saw, that was neat, beautiful light. We just had the one leopard sighting, and didn't see any cheetahs, saw lions. Didn't see any male lions this time, but we did see a few different prides, including some tiny little cubs. That was neat. But this was the only leopard sighting, and that was also in Etosha National Park. And this is in Anguma Private Game Reserve, which borders Etosha, and they have a very unique blind that's dug into the ground. So you're shooting from ground level, looking up at these animals at the watering hole, and saw a lot of different species there too.
What type of animal is that in the center?
That's a wildebeest in the foreground there, surrounded by
Okay.
zebras.
Yeah.
And one of the cutest animals ever, the warthog. Also from that ground hole blind in Anguma Private Reserve.
That is it.
Okay, thank you.
And Jules, you're up.
Okay. This is my 60th year of making family calendars. And every year what we do is try to capture what we did in the preceding year. This is the January photo on the calendar, and it's taken this September when the road lottery didn't work. Next. A lot of the photographs are from the Homer area. We went to the Shorebird Festival, and then COVID said we ought not to, Peg and I ought not to be fraternizing outside of the home. So we kind of stayed home. So a lot of the images this year were based on the one trip to Homer in the spring. Next. I like this one for the wing shapes and the separation. Again, that's March. Next, shorebirds galore. Next. This is an experiment in terms of what the new mirrorless cameras can do. This is a cropped image. It's about, well, it's less than a quarter of the image. The next one, please. That's the full image. So you can see I made significant crops to the image to get what I figured was the best focal point in the area. Next, please. Lesser yellow legs, again, Homer. Next. One of my favorites, the shoveler. Next. The American widgeon, that was here in town at Westchester. And this was at the floatplane lake here, Lake Hood here in town. Both Chuck Maas and I don't know whether anybody else separately saw this bird, just magnificent. Next, please.
What kind of bird is that?
It's a red-throated loon.
I don't think I've ever seen one.
They're not that common here in the Anchorage area. You've got 3 species. The Pacific is the one you see the most of.
Yeah.
Next, please. Sandhills. Again, Homer. Next. Pintails. That was, again, here in town. They came over, again, the composition of the wings and 2 drakes and a hen.
Beautiful.
Next. And of course, we spent our obligatory time on Prince William Sound. This was in late August, a sunrise with both the moon in the upper right-hand corner and its reflection down in the lower right-hand corner, and a gull flying across that sometimes you can see. Next, please. Swans. Potter marsh. I like the center line since it's wiggly. This is the road into Denali.
And that's it.
Say again.
That's it.
I think there's one more.
I don't see an arrow, so.
Well, didn't show up. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Jules. That was great.
And Tyler, you're up. Tyler with us? Okay, I guess I'll be showing these. It looks like probably the hillside. Winter Creek looks like. That reminds me a little bit of the Rise of Skywalker. I like that shot.
The waterfalls was in Prince William Sound.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
Loop in there in the middle of the picture. Anybody know where that place is? Solitary hut somewhere.
Looks like Denali.
Yeah. Burned area, it looks like. Like the lighting in this one. Beautiful.
Alex Posey said that hut looks like it's the one along the bomber traverse.
Yeah. That's it for Tyler. Beautiful images, people.
Yeah, very nice tonight. Thank you for everybody for sharing.
Gorgeous. I'm sorry you was.
I saw him here earlier. Well, I think that's all we have. Keep
Yep.
an eye on the emails to see what the January plans are.
Yeah.
Well, Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yeah. Very, very much so to all of you. Yep.
Yeah.
May Santa bring you everything you want.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many people left on, but Merry Christmas, everybody. It's great to see everybody. And
Yeah.
maybe next month we'll see you in person. That would be so sweet.
Yay.
Way long
Uh,
overdue.
I was going to say Santa's bringing me my new Canon 500 lens.
There you go. Yeah. I think I'll put that on my list too.
Yeah. So if we meet, will it be at the museum?
Yes.
Hopefully.
Okay.